Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me today, wherever you are in the world. And I do hope that you've had a fabulous day. I can't believe how close we're getting to Christmas and Thanksgiving. It's quite extraordinary, really. But before we get started, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. I just want to send my love to each and every one of you, and I hope you're doing remarkably well. Tonight's story is very different, and I think you're really going to love it because I certainly did. And it really gives you a chance to sort of experience another place in time that really was quite different. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Janice. And I did not personally have a Bigfoot encounter, but my cousin Hugh most certainly did, and he will be telling you his story through this anonymous forum after much coaxing and persuading from me, which was not easy, I assure you. My mother is initially from Manchester in England, and she married my American father, and subsequently emigrated from England and moved to North America, where they finally settled down in rural Kentucky, where I subsequently was born. My mother's sister stayed in Manchester and married a Londoner, and they both moved to Chelsea in London, where Hugh was born, who was obviously my cousin on my mother's side of the family. My story begins in the late 70s, when I was about 18 years old, and my mother wanted me to fly to London to stay with my aunt and uncle in their Chelsea apartment, and to meet my cousin Hugh. I was terribly excited because I'd never flown on an international flight before, and I'd also never met my cousin, nor had I ever visited London, and I'd heard so many things about the place. I remember arriving in London, which was one of the most exciting, exhilarating experiences of my entire life that I can never, ever forget. I could feel the vibe and buzzing energy of this vivacious, exuberant, charming city, and it was unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my entire life. My heart was fluttering with excitement, and I remember climbing in the back of a black London taxicab, where I was greeted by a friendly Cockney cabby. "Where are you from, love?" he asked. "I'm from Kentucky in America," I replied. "That's a long way from home. Have you ever been to London before, love?" "No, this is my first time," I said. "I'm going to be staying with my mother's family in Chelsea." "Do you need the address?" I asked. "Not really, love. Just give me the name of the street. I know London like the back of my hand." As I looked out of the taxi window, I was in total awe. I could sense the palpable history of this great, remarkable, intriguing city. There were red London buses, black London taxi cabs, cars and people bustling around, minding their own business. There were exquisite, classic, imposing buildings that looked like architectural masterpieces, interesting, prestigious, regal-looking statues of both lions and dragons. There were bright red London telephone boxes and gorgeous parks covered with emerald green grass and dotted with tall, majestic, statuesque oaks. When we passed Buckingham Palace, I was in utter reverence at the extraordinary pomp and ceremony of the palace itself, which appeared so palatial, stately and magisterial, and I could see the dignified palace guards, dressed in black and red, standing imposingly in front of the noble imperial palace. Chelsea was very classy. It was stylish, exclusive, and a high-class area. It was certainly a prestigious, upscale, expensive part of London. Of that there was no doubt. The perfect symmetrical residential apartment blocks were painted in white and very smart and classical, with attractive design motifs done in pretty spirals. There was large white rectangular windows, white stylized columns and porches that were topped with pediment. Then there was dark wrought iron work done in classic twirls and frills, creating very distinguished-looking balustrades that framed the outer entrances to the buildings and the lower staircases to the basement apartments. I could quite literally imagine the horse and wagons from times gone by trotting down these quaint little streets, and men from the past wearing their top hat and tails. It was a nostalgic sense of history that was so clearly palpable to me that I could see it, feel it, and taste it, much like a time traveller transporting myself back in time. It truly felt like that. My aunt and uncle were delighted to meet me, and they were warm, congenial and welcoming, and incredibly British with very polished upscale London accents. "Oh, my dear," said my aunt, "you do look just like your mother when she was your age, and the likeness is quite remarkable. It really is uncanny. So what do you think of London so far?" she asked me. "Beautiful," I said. "Quite beautiful. We're going to take you to Carnaby Street, well, at least I am, dear, where your cousin Hugh works, selling leather belts and studs. I do think I should warn you, it's going to be a bit of a culture shock for you, and I do think Hugh's appearance might be rather unsettling and perturbing for you, but I want to assure you he's an absolute honey bunch and a sweetie pie to boot, and I know he cannot wait to meet you." I wondered what on earth my aunt meant by culture shock. What did she mean when she said I'd be shocked by my cousin's appearance, I wondered. My aunt hailed down a taxicab on the side of the road, and the taxi dropped us off at Carnaby Street. It was like a bustling world of blazing bright colours and exhilarating excitement. I know of no other way to describe it to you, only that it was simply, utterly marvellous, and words fail me to chronicle for you the electrifying, stirring and thrilling ambience of this compelling place. Strange-looking eccentric people were absolutely everywhere. In fact, I was the one that stood out among the punk rockers in my very average conservative American clothes that seemed positively drab by contrast to everybody else. Everyone was attired in punk rock styles, with divergent, spiky hairstyles highlighted in bright colours that looked remarkably like hedgehogs or the spikes down a dragon's tail. I'd never seen so many wacko mohawks or Mohicans, I think you call them that, with their peculiar, idiosyncratic hairstyles that possibly required a gallon of hair gel to stick up like that. The hair was dyed in the brightest colours, whites, reds, pinks and greens. The punks all had piercings in their ears and down the sides of their earlobes, in their noses and on the edges of their lips, and even, believe it or not, on their tongues, not to mention their nipples were also pierced. Some punks had their earskins stretched deliberately so there were 2 large gaping holes in the earlobes. The clothes they wore were incredible. For the females, they literally loved the black watch tartan skater dress or pleated short skirts with platform shoes, leather jackets, oversized cardigans, combat boots, and holey tights. I noticed the men tended to wear spiked clothing. Scowl rings and heavily studded leather boots were the order of the day, along with lots of studded leather jewellery like dog collars and hand collars, as well as belts. I kid you not, the vibe of this city was remarkable, unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my entire life, and the individual punk rock styles were utterly amazing, and they ranged from being very unusual to being quirky and different, that you could have been forgiven for believing that you had entered the Twilight Zone and encountered a whole new species of human being. I promise you, the late 70s and 80s were possibly one of the most exciting times to be alive in London history, because the city was literally electric with excitement, and the best music in modern memory. Let's not forget that either. I was so excited by all these unorthodox punk rock people with their novel, kinky makeup, exciting, spiked, colourful hairstyles, studded and sometimes even tattooed bodies. I just remember walking down Carnaby Street with my mouth open in shock and my eyes the size of tennis balls. It was a whole new world for me that seemed so surreal, as I'd never known so many exotic, quirky people like this before, and they all appeared so uniquely different that each person looked like a non-conforming work of art. In Carnaby Street there were dozens of quintessential tourist shops, with circulating racks of colourful postcards, often of the punks themselves, and souvenirs of London such as the potato sack shopping bags with Carnaby Street, Oxford Street and King's Road logos printed on them. There were mugs, key rings and miniature London buses, as well as little toy soldiers, plates and London posters that were all for sale as well. Then there were shops literally filled with rocking music that was pumping throughout the day, along with shops that would sell leather, studded belts and all the stylized punk rock regalia. I was so bedazzled and bewitched by this amazing place, and the vibe was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It was vibrant and incredibly exciting. "It's a whole other world," said my aunt, looking at my animated face and laughing. "I see you like it. "Oh, yes, I do," I said. "It's amazing. I've never seen anything like it before. Such an exhilarating buzz with people dressing rebelliously to shock, amaze, and draw attention to themselves. It's a whole nother world," I said. "I can't imagine what my parents would think if they were here." "Just as well they're not," she said. "Now to meet your cousin," said my aunt. "This is going to be a culture shock," she said. "He manages the punk rock den shop over there," she said. I followed my aunt up a couple of steps into a cosy shop where there was this vibey synthesizer music playing. There was an area where people were having piercings done, as well as a very interesting-looking tattoo parlour that was very busy, and there were racks of spiky leather jackets and punk rock belts for sale. I saw a young man standing behind the shop counter, looking much like all the other punk rockers that I'd seen earlier during the day walking down Carnaby Street, which made him appear dauntingly unapproachable to me. He had whiter than white spiked hair that stood up in 5 big dragon spikes down the centre of his head, while the side of his head was meticulously shaved. He had 2 massive big black studs in both of his ears, and small silver studs down the side of his earlobes. He also had studs in his nose and on the edges of his mouth, and if it was at all possible, even on his tongue. He was wearing smart jeans that were heavily studded, and a dog collar around his neck, and a spiky punk rock black leather jacket was worn over his bare chest, which was heavily tattooed with eagles, and he had 2 prominent nipple piercings. I noticed his face was so made up, with very dramatic colours, just like Boy George would actually wear. I followed my aunt to the counter where my cousin Hugh was standing with a welcoming broad beam on his face. It was hard to fathom that he was actually my cousin. He seemed like a colourful, out-of-world, exotic human species, but when he opened his mouth, he spoke with such a lovely, soft London accent and seemed very normal and approachable, which was incongruous with his eye-catching appearance, let me tell you. It was not long before I realised that despite our differences, Hugh and I had so much in common, and he gallantly took me all over London and introduced me to all his peculiar but very charming punk rock friends. On one occasion, my cousin's friend made me up with a funky hairstyle to look like a punk rocker myself, and it was incredibly fun. I barely recognised myself in the mirror when I stared at my blonde hair that had been transformed into bright pink spikes, and I was wearing combat boots, black holey tights, a black spiky jacket, and a black watch tartan skirt, which is that red and black tartan traditional short-pleated skirt that you see. It was very liberating to dress like this, and believe me, I've never had so much fun. It really was one of the most exciting times in my life, and I would go so far as to say that the buzzing vibe of the late 70s and early 80s in London was unlike anything that I have ever known and experienced in my entire life. It was an incredibly exciting time to be alive. The music of the late 70s and early 80s was literally the best music I have ever known. I was to learn that these punk rockers hated the establishment and prided themselves in not conforming to society's expectations or stereotypes of them. They prided themselves in individuality, looking and being different. They used their shocking, colourful appearances as a tool to express their identity and individuality, and I admired that greatly. Before long, I developed an incredible relationship with Hugh, and we were both single children without brothers and sisters, so he became like a brother, and the brother that I never had, and I became like a sister to him. By the time I had to leave London, I felt as if I had known my mother's sister and her family all my life, and a close bond had been formed. Hugh and I began writing to each other about twice a week, and in those days, getting an overseas letter was terribly, terribly exciting. Imagine my amazement when I realised that Hugh was coming to stay with me in rural Kentucky on our farm. I had one looming concerning thought at the back of my mind, and that was how Hugh was going to be perceived by my friends in Kentucky because of the startling, shocking way he looked. I realised it was going to be an interesting and curious time, and my friends and parents would be in for a surprise awakening. They would soon learn that there were other colourful humans in the world, with a dress code uniquely their own. I had lived in rural Kentucky all my life, and we lived on a large farm where we grew corn, raised chickens, and managed a small dairy herd. We lived in a rather lovely rustic-looking farmhouse, very traditional of the time, that was painted in pale lemon creaming yellow, with white sash windows and shutters and a black slate roof. We also had a few outbuildings and sheds on our property, and 2 lovely Newfoundland dogs. On the right-hand side of our property was a very large wooded area that consisted primarily of oaks, maples, walnuts and pine trees, and there were woods which were quite literally teeming with an abundance of wildlife, especially white-tailed deer. On one occasion we'd had too many wild hog on our land that had been culled because they were doing so much damage to the environment, but luckily it never presented a problem again, as clearly there were other predators keeping the hog population at bay. On the northern side of our property was the most magnificent silvery lake that you have ever seen, that was surrounded by a high hilly embankment, and also large pretty trees. It was an exquisite area that attracted the most phenomenal bird life that you have ever seen, and wild duck were a firm favourite with me, especially when mother duck had baby ducklings on the go. I just loved those ducklings. I remember the day that my parents met my cousin Hugh for the very first time like it was yesterday, because it was so hilariously funny. My parents were so shocked, and I had to suppress my laughter because my mother looked like she would literally pass out with shock when she saw his bright pink dragon tail spiked hairstyle and all his tattoos, piercings, studs, along with the heavy makeup look. I think she was unable to digest what she was actually seeing and gave me an earful later for not warning her about Hugh's punk rock appearance. "Why does he dress like that?" she asked me in astonishment. "In all my born days, I've never ever seen anything like it. I seriously nearly had a heart attack. This is my sister's son we're talking about. I would never have believed in a month of Sundays that this was possible. How extraordinary." I'm not going to lie to you when I admit that I rather enjoyed shocking people when I introduced them to Cousin Hugh for the first time, because the reactions were incredibly hilarious, and all these years later I have to chuckle when I remember it all. One Sunday when I was attending church and my mother was suggesting that perhaps we left Hugh at home because the congregation might be a little shocked by his appearance. But I told my mother she was being utterly ridiculous. I remember we arrived at church 5 minutes late and people were about to start singing when Hugh walked into the service. I will never forget the shocked heads that turned around to observe the strange, curious, colourful, spiky man taking a seat behind a pew next to me. I noticed the priest was so agog, he literally dropped his Bible on the ground. There were whispers, giggles and furtive glances as people regarded Hugh like a strange exotic specimen from a zoo. The people in the pews behind Hugh could not see a thing because his hairstyle was so high on his head that they couldn't see in front of themselves. I can remember the priest could not keep his eyes off Hugh because he had not ever seen anything like him before in his entire life, and he kept losing his place on the Bible passages. It was so funny. One day my mother and I went into the local town to buy some groceries, and Hugh decided to stay at home. This is his incredible story, in his own words. "Hi, I'm Hugh, and yes, I was a punk rocker in London for many years, although I'm not anymore, and I was even personal friends with Boy George for a long while, and he was and is an exceptionally nice man, I might add. Being a punk for many years was a way of expressing myself and just letting go. I didn't want to conform to the establishment and the stereotypes of the day that clearly thought any self-respecting British man should be dressed conservatively in a suit and a pinstriped shirt. That was not for me. I didn't want to conform to worldly stereotypes or government ideals, and so I naturally rebelled against them. I think dressing the way I did was an art form. Instead of using brush, oils and canvas to express myself, I used my body as that canvas. I also enjoyed shocking people by being unconventional and different and not giving a hoot what people actually thought of me, which was very liberating, I might add. I was used to getting strange comments about my appearance, and never more so when I came to rural Kentucky. I heard a little girl saying, "Mummy, look at that funny man wearing a dragon's tail on his head." And I heard a little boy say, "Mummy, that man's wearing lots and lots of drawing pins on his body." So yes, I've had my fair share of eyeballing, whispering and giggles, but I enjoy being so interesting that people would actually want to talk about me. If I was a painting on a wall that people barely acknowledged, That would make it very mediocre. But if I possessed a painting that people talked about either negatively or even positively, then I've engaged their attention in some way. As punk rockers, we have a saying, I'd rather be ugly, 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 different, 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 beautiful, 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 but never plain, mediocre or nondescript, because in all honesty, there's nothing worse. As you can imagine, I ruffled a few feathers coming from the punk rock of Carnaby Street to the rural landscape of rural Kentucky, which incidentally I loved, and I will say that your America is utterly exquisite. It's a beautiful country indeed, and you need to treasure it and value it, 'cause she's lovely. Even though I grew up in London, I love the natural world. Not that I was well informed about it, but I was curious and eager to experience a ramble in the countryside, just as much as the next man would. On the day that Cousin Janice and Aunt Sue went to town, I decided to take a hike in the countryside, decked to the nines in my punk rock ensemble, which I naturally wore every day without fail. I was entering the wooded part of the land, and I was enjoying my country walk considerably, and the sound of the birdsong in the valley. But after a while the birdsong all but dissipated, which I thought was exceedingly odd. I then noticed this tree swaying backwards and forwards all on its own, and I got the very distinct impression that something or someone was actually watching me, and it really set my nerves on edge. I also could detect the strange rancid odour in the air that was pretty disgusting and smelt exactly like stale urine and cheesy trainers. Not that I'm any expert on smells. I could see the branch of this huge tree swaying backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and the tree was incredibly large. I wondered how it was conceivable that this tree could move like this without a heavy wind behind it. The feeling that someone was staring at me was very, very evident, and I get stared at a lot, so I always know when someone is actually scrutinising me, and normally I enjoy being stared at, but this time it felt really uncomfortable. I looked around and saw absolutely nothing, which didn't do any justice to me. I couldn't understand it. Suddenly I heard this long whistle that seemed to resonate over the valley. In truth, I thought it was a bird of some kind, and then this was followed by the sound of something or someone thumping a very large tree about 6 times, making a sound ominously like thunder. The next thing I knew was I kept hearing whistles from all over the valley, coming from every part all at once. It was really bizarre. Then I began to hear these trees being banged from far away. It was very, very weird, and I was more curious than alarmed because it felt like something very extraordinary was about to happen. Almost like the feeling you get when you realise the heavens are about to open and unload their hailstones upon you. It was that sort of anticipatory, expectant kind of feeling. Suddenly I heard this booming sound, and it sounded exactly like carriages with horses were reverberating through the woods at every angle, and they were thundering towards me. And then they just suddenly stopped, just like that. I saw trees everywhere, and I mean everywhere, not just isolated. Trees that were everywhere, moving backwards and forwards, and it felt like hundreds of eyes were staring upon me. All I knew is it was an airy, out-of-worldly feeling. The next thing I knew is that this creature jumped out of the undergrowth towards me. First one, then another, and another, and another, and I found myself being surrounded by dozens of creatures, the likes of such that I have never seen before. I was utterly dumbfounded, startled, and bedazzled. I didn't know what on earth to think. Should I be terrified, afraid, calm, or relaxed? What were these things, I wondered? These creatures were like huge humanoid giants. They were absolutely colossal in size and built like rhinos or elephants, as they were absolutely massive, very burly, densely thick, and incredibly muscular. They were covered with long hazelnut hair, and they had long arms and human-like hands and feet. The creatures were all relatively similar in size, although the smallest was about 7 foot tall and the largest about 11 foot, and they would have weighed roughly between 8 to 1,000 pounds, and they were about 4 feet wide. I have no idea what these creatures actually were. I wish I did, but I didn't. And they proceeded to walk around me in a circle as if they were trying to work out what kind of species of human I actually was. They weren't at all aggressive about me, but instead rather fascinated and intrigued, and they were pointing to my hair and chatting away excitedly. One touched one of my pink spikes, and then they all did, one at a time, and they began to chatter away excitedly to each other. And it is like they were discussing me, intently. They were examining me for a long while. Even my makeup got their attention. And once again they chattered backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and the language they spoke was like that of a monkey, but it did seem like a language. In that moment I was too shocked to actually be scared. I kept thinking to myself, what the heck are these creatures? Because I've never seen anything like them before. I think my hairstyle baffled them immensely because they thought it grew on my head like that. They had no idea how much craftsmanship was used to make my hair look so distinguished. After the creatures had finished observing me, they all thundered back into the woods, galloping like horses, and then they were gone. Once they were gone, I seemed to get a delayed reaction and bolted back to the house as fast as I could, suddenly feeling a delayed sense of fear. It was like I suddenly realised that I'd been surrounded by very dangerous predators that could easily have killed me if they'd wanted to. For many long years I would wonder what on earth those critters were that I had encountered on my cousin's Kentucky farm. Sadly, I'm no longer a punk rocker anymore, as it was indeed one of the most exciting, adventurous times of my young life. But much like fashion, so do the eras change, as nothing ever stays constant or remains the same. As life always evolves, it changes and metamorphosises into something else and something new. If you visit London today, the old Carnaby street with its flamboyant punk rockers no longer exists, and you may wonder what happened to all those punk rockers. Their stories are probably much like mine. They literally are normal people today, just like you or me. I suppose we grew up, settled down, and no longer needed to dress in the way we did in those days. It took me ages to get my hair looking like that when I was young, and I doubt I would have the energy today to dye it again and stick it up like that. It was a long process. Nowadays, despite the eagle tattoos, I suppose I look relatively normal for a man of my age, and even the piercings have all but gone. But believe me, one thing that never changes is the memories. They most certainly are as real today as they were then. So there you are. That's my story. Oh my word, isn't that the most exciting story that you've ever heard? Well, one of them, because I know it just literally lights up Carnaby Street for us. And we begin to see that part of the world really, really clearly, and what it must have been like to be moving around and seeing all these incredible punks and going into those amazing shops and feeling the buzz and the vibrancy of London. And can you imagine what those Bigfoots must have been like? Because I know when I once went to a monkey sanctuary, I think it was in Thailand, and I was standing there around a fruit bowl, and I said to the guard, I said, "There's nobody here. There can't be any monkeys around." And he said to me, "They're everywhere." He says they've seen the fruit and they're about to come right now to eat it. And out of nowhere, these monkeys had been watching the fruit bowl, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then suddenly there were about 50 of these monkeys all around us, gobbling the fruit, very, very excited. And I think Bigfoots watch us, and they know so much about us, which would explain why when the punk was standing there in the woods, looking so different to you or me, that must have been such a shock to the Bigfoots. And they literally sent out a call, and there was the wood knocking and the whistling, and then the Bigfoots just came literally around this punk, wanting to sort of investigate what on earth he was, because they were so utterly enthralled. They literally thought his big dragon spike on his head was literally grown by his body. But it wasn't, of course. They were so fascinated. So I think if you want to get a Bigfoot out, you might need to dress like a punk rocker. Until next time, goodbye and good night. And by the way, tell me, what do you think of that fashion?